Hello, Vijay, can you hear me? Vijay, can you hear me? Yeah, you have to unmute.
Sorry about that. Somehow we thought it was an hour from now.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
Okay, finally.
No worries.
Yeah, okay, so I'm going to start now. Uh, can everyone see me? Okay, good evening, comrades. Joining from all over the world, this is Kasun, and I will be the host for today's lecture of four series lecture series celebrating 80th anniversary of Communist Party of Sri Lanka. Today's lecture is New Era Imperialism and Multipolarity, and today's lecture conducted by Vijay Prasada. For those of you who need an introduction, Vijay is a historian, journalist, and a political critic, and he wrote numerous books on imperialism, and he's the director of Tricontinental. Here we have the chairman of the Communist Party of Sri Lanka, D. Gunasekara. Our general secretary send us his regards to Vijay Prasad. Unfortunately, he will be not joining today because he's in China participating to an event organized by the Communist Party of China. Before Vijay's speech, I would like to give you a brief introduction of the Communist Party of Sri Lanka. Communist Party of Sri Lanka was founded in 1943 and has been consistent anti-imperialist party in Sri Lanka. Founder of Communist Party Sri Lanka, S.A. Wickramasinghe, is the first Marxist who got elected to State Council of Ceylon in 1931. Communist Party played a major role in forging diplomatic ties with communist countries all over the world. And even today, it is one of the main parties in Sri Lanka that stands for maintaining diplomatic ties with communist countries around the world. Communist Party of Sri Lanka is among the leading parties that promote multipolarity and defend multipolarity in Sri Lanka. This is exactly why Communist Party of Sri Lanka decided to do this event on multipolarity, and we decided to have Vijay Prasad, and we thought that he's the right candidate for the job. So Vijay, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, first, congratulations to the Communist Party of Sri Lanka for its 80th birthday, and greetings to Wilfred, who has been one of the stalwarts, not only in the Communist Party of Sri Lanka. It's nice to see you, but also in international Cuba solidarity work, an important frontline in communist internationalism of our time. So it's great to be with you. I'm really very happy to be here. I'm going to talk a little bit about the changing dynamics in the world and also the necessity for the left to develop new projects for this period. And so I'm going to take some time, if you don't mind, to first build the narrative. I think we are now, and then spend much less time on the kind of projects we need to build. And hopefully that will lead into the discussion. So I hope that's okay. The talk will be in about 5 sections. So I'll indicate that as we go along. The first section is what we might call unipolarity. Now, it's important to understand the United States since 1945, which is the end of the big war of the 20th century, has attempted to exercise what it at first called preponderant power. Preponderant power. It's an extraordinary phrase which was used by the United States government in documents in the late 1940s. Preponderant. It's an interesting word. It has a religious origin. It sort of means almost divine power. complete power over the planet. The United States has sought this leadership role through the exercise of preponderant power since at least 1945. This is not something that waited for the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. You know, people conventionally put the period of unipolarity from 1991 onward. In fact, the United States sought unipolarity from 1945. At the time, the United States was blocked by two principal forces in the world. First was the socialist camp. This included, of course, the Soviet Union, Vietnam, China, and so on. And eventually, in 1959, Cuba. The socialist camp played a very important role in blocking the ambitions of US imperialism, which sought preponderant power, in other words, unipolarity. So one of the barriers in the socialist bloc. The second barrier was actually a little surprising, and that's the barrier of the Third World Project, which included right-leaning like the regime in Sri Lanka, or at the time Ceylon. Sir John Wickramasinghe and others in Ceylon also played a role, despite their closeness, proximity to US imperialism, role in the broader development of the Third World Project. We forget Sri Lanka was a party to the Bandung Conference of 1955 held in Indonesia. But this Third World Project goes from, let's say, right-leaning regimes, such as Sir John Wickramasinghe's regime, all the way out to the left, including Cuba, 1959, becomes a key part of the Third World Project. So the second barrier, ambitions of the United States government, was the Third World Project. Now, the US government continually tried to establish its hegemony in the world through the exercise of power via coup d'etats, in Iran, 1953, against the government of Guatemala, 1954. And then the most important coups, 4 of them that took place in the 3 large continents of the global South. First, the coup against the government of Patrice Lumumba in the Congo, 1961, which was followed by the coup against Kwame Nkrumah in 1966 in Ghana, the mentor of Lumumba, close friend of Lumumba. These 2 coups, in a sense, put back the advance of national liberation on the African continent. Then there was the coup in 1964 in Brazil, which the United States conducted against the government of João Goulart. This put the national liberation forces in Latin America on the back foot, forces that had been unleashed by the Cuban Revolution of 1959. These were put on the back foot as coup after coup took place in countries in Latin America. And the third continent, of course, is Asia, where the coup against the government of Suharto in Sukarno in Indonesia in 1965, with 1 million people of the left, including almost the entire Communist Party, was assassinated. 1 million people were killed in 1965 in Indonesia. The entire Communist Party was wiped out, declared illegal, Marxism banned. This was the largest Communist Party outside Soviet Union and China, was entirely annihilated. Barely a memory of this in many of our movements, comrades. It's important to recognize what was done to the Indonesians. That puts communism in Asia on the back foot. Imagine if you had the revolution in Vietnam in 1945, the revolution in China in 1949, the revolutionary developments in Northern Korea in the 1950s, and then if there had been a revolution in Indonesia, imagine the balance of forces in Asia, the kind of pressure that would have on countries like India, on Sri Lanka, and so on. The revolutionary currents in Pakistan at this time, which then through the coup of Ayub Khan were put on the back foot. These coups had a big role in decimating the left. But nonetheless, US preponderant power, unipolarity, could not be established. With the 2 barriers, the barrier of the Soviet camp and the barrier of the Third World Project remained intact. These barriers collapsed in the late 1980s. Number one, the revisionism in the Communist Party of the Soviet Union essentially abdicated its responsibility and dissolved the Soviet Union in 1991, an act of great sorrow for the world. Then the Eastern European communist state system effectively collapsed from the East Germans all the way down to Romania. So then that barrier to the to US ambitions declined. This put a lot of pressure at the same time through the debt crisis, third world countries. Third world debt crisis, which had its most spectacular moment in Mexico in 1982, when Mexico declared bankruptcy, the first big country of its kind to declare bankruptcy. The political pressure of the third world project declined dramatically in the 1980s. I mean, the NAM meeting, non-aligned movement meeting in Delhi in 1983 was an indicator of the lack of confidence. These countries collapsed. They all went in for IMF-driven structural adjustment projects. So the third world project collapsed. United States enters the 1990s in a position of extreme confidence, feeling now that preponderant power was at hand, that unipolarity was at hand, which is why the US drove the establishment of the World Trade Organization, set up in 1994. However, I would like to caution us, despite the fact that it appears with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the demise of the Third World Project, even though it appears as if the US established unipolarity, it did not. It continued to face challenges. Where were these challenges coming from? Well, the US government named them rogue states. For instance, North Korea, Iran, Cuba, and so on were named rogue states. They refused to give up, like the village in Gaul, not Gaul, Sri Lanka, but Gaul, Old France, written by the Asterix and Obelix comics, like the little village of Asterix and Obelix that refuses to surrender to the Roman Empire. There were large parts of the world that refused to surrender to US ambitions. And these played a thorny role for US ambitions. The United States tried all kinds of mechanisms to overthrow these governments, and including grotesque warfare, a suffocation of entire countries, like the intensified embargo on Cuba. Well, so this first phase of the US attempt to establish unipolarity actually had some successes, because in the 1990s, it is true that many countries came under the sway of US power. They surrendered their political power to the US State Department, and they surrendered their economic power to the International Monetary Fund. So despite the fact that the US was not able to establish total power over the world, it certainly did exercise leadership, and using its allies in the G7, that is Canada, West Germany, then later Germany, France, Italy, Japan, and the United Kingdom. These other 6 countries were kind of lieutenants of US power as it sought hegemony in the world. And it had other allies, Colombia in South America, Israel in West Asia, looking all allies, Philippines, Pakistan, and so on, Thailand, looking for other allies. It's very interesting that many of the key allies of the US government are garrison military states. For instance, interest, effectively a monarchical military dictatorship, the people of Thailand never able to establish proper democracy. Colombia, until recently, effectively an oligarchic military dictatorship, with elections for sure, but immense violence against the people. Israel, a settler colonial garrison state. Pakistan, punctual military coups against the people of Pakistan. If you take all the principal US allies, very interesting that many of them, including South Korea, a military dictatorship, Taiwan, a military dictatorship until very recently, each of them, was a military garrison state used by the US to essentially extend its power around the world. Phase 1, the attempt at unipolarity. Phase 2, fragility. The second point, fragility. You see, there's an interesting theme or thought experiment that you can conduct. It would have been impossible, for instance, for earlier attempts at world leadership to have had a total, control of the world. For instance, the Italian city-states or the Dutch, when they were attempting to exercise power around the world, simply could not, because they didn't have the technological means. When the Dutch were trying to establish the empire in parts of Sri Lanka and Indonesia and so on, they had to rely on sailing ships. They had to rely on the mail, sailing ships carrying information and so on. As we've gone and advanced over the centuries with air travel, with immediate communication through things like Zoom, internet, and so on, it's much easier to establish global hegemony. The time of transportation, the movement of troops, the movement of information, it's much swifter now than it used to be. So it's of course to be understood that the United States was really the first to attempt global domination, not only because of something to do divinely with the US, but also with the technological the technology is available in the world. When the US made its move to world hegemony, the technologies favored actually a kind of global power. Nonetheless, there were a couple of problems that the US faced. One is, by all metrics, the United States is the most powerful military in the world. It can destroy any country. The US can send its missiles, its planes to bomb anywhere, any country, including its now most important competitor, China. It could conduct a nuclear strike on China, which China would be hurt by, quite deeply hurt. The United States has the capacity because it spends half the world's total military budget is spent just by the United States. I mean, half the world's total. Last year, $2 trillion was spent on military budgets. The US government by itself spent nearly $1 trillion. It has the military capacity, it also spends for it. Well, this is interesting, and it produces two challenges. Number one, it was clear from the war against the Iraqis conducted from 1991 all the way till about 2017, a very long war that the US prosecuted in Iraq. And then the war in Afghanistan against the Afghan people from 2001 till 2021. These two wars demonstrate something interesting. The United States has the capacity to destroy a country. It can bomb the country, but it can't govern the country. It can't dominate the people. It finds it hard to do that. And so there is a kind of confidence in the ability of the US to actually exercise power. It can exercise the ability to destroy, but it can't exercise control over countries. It can't effectively exercise hegemony. The war against the Iraqis, I think, was the great overextension of US power. The US, during the so-called war on terror, attempted to fight on many battlefields. United States military doctrine since 1995 had effectively created a military force capable of fighting two wars at the same time. That's the structure of their planning, the two-war doctrine. But in fact, the administration after 2003 was fighting multiple wars: Somalia, Iraq, Afghanistan, trying to suffocate the Cubans, trying to overthrow the government in Venezuela, and so on, and effectively didn't have the technological capacity to fight so many wars, then prosecuting a build-up against China and so on. So it overextended its military power. That was one point where the fragility of the US project began to show itself. The second area where the fragility of the US began to show itself was in economic power. Now, after 1945, United States and the British established the gold system and the Bretton Woods system as paramount, that all countries around the world had to basically organize their trade and development networks through the World Bank and through the International Monetary Fund. There was an attempt to create a World Trade Organization, at the time called the International Trade Organization, but that failed. But the Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF and the World Bank in particular, were controlled by Washington, D.C. and the Europeans. And in fact, countries had to put or surrender to some extent their fiscal and monetary policy to these agencies. Now, the Third World tried to resist this through the creation of the UN Conference on Trade and Development in 1904. The Third World tried to resist this by creating its own forms of inter or south, what we later call South-South trading networks. and so on. These worked in a fashion and had a role. But in 1971, the US government did something really interesting. The Nixon administration, faced with struggles inside the US itself, the economic struggles, broke the gold standard and established the dollar as the principal currency for reconciliation of trade and the holding of wealth. Now, the whole world could have rejected the dollar in 1971, but in fact, the world didn't. There's a couple of reasons why we accepted the dollar as the paramount currency. Firstly, because the international trade and investment organizations, that is to say, the World Bank, IMF, the London and Paris group of multilateral lenders, international credit markets, the SWIFT system, and so on and so forth. The SWIFT system, which allows you to move money across international boundaries. All of these institutions began to adopt the dollar, largely through political pressure from the United States. So one was political pressure, which establishes the dollar. And countries simply had to go to international credit capital markets to borrow because they couldn't go anywhere else. I mean, it suddenly happened that since 1945, a lot of trade was reconciled in dollars. It's convenient to actually trade in dollars. It's actually very convenient. Let me give you an example. Let's take Sri Lanka-India trade. Now, India is a very large country. Sri Lanka is a much smaller country, produces much less goods and services than India. If India and Sri Lanka decided to trade in each other's currencies, at the end of the day, it's likely that India would be holding more Sri Lankan money than Sri Lanka holds Indian money. And the reason for that is that probably India will export more goods and services to Sri Lanka than Sri Lanka does to India. I'm putting this hypothetically, but actually it's true. If you look at the trade statistics, which I looked at yesterday. So now what does India do with the Sri Lankan money that it's holding? Is it going to go to, let's say, Bangladesh and say, look, we'll pay you for jute in Sri Lankan money? Bangladeshis are going to say, we don't want that money. You know, we don't do enough trade with Sri Lanka for the money for us to buy goods and services from Sri Lanka. So in fact, the reason why the dollar became the paramount currency was not only the political pressure, but also convenience. That if every country is holding their external reserves in dollars, trade with each other in dollars. It's a matter of convenience. You don't need the dollar for this. You could have chosen an international currency, like the IMF standard drawing rights could have been chosen. But historically, the dollar became part of our world. Now, by doing this, the US government had an advantage for many decades. It could print as many dollars as it wants because it exported dollars. So you could increase the money supply. You had no problem with inflation domestically. You just export the dollars for the international reconciliation of trade. That's dollars played a role there. This allowed the US to carry enormous current accounts and to carry an enormous debt. The US debt to GDP ratio is very high for an advanced industrial country. But because of the use of the dollar outside US borders, this was not an affliction to the economy, if you know what I'm saying. So for many decades, the US took advantage of this, but this crashes in the 2000s. Now, the crisis that provokes the crash is the problem in the US housing market. You know, when banks were giving loans to people who couldn't pay their mortgage payments, and then you had a collapse in 2006 of the housing market in the US, which leads to a banking crisis. This crisis, the housing crisis, which is a parochial crisis, it's a US crisis, suddenly creates an international problem because it could have brought down the whole international banking system. And this was a problem for international capital. International capital quickly organized a rescue, including going to India, China, Indonesia, Mexico, asking for surpluses to be drawn into the international credit markets to basically liquefy Western banking systems. And these countries did it, but they thought there's a problem here. And the Chinese in particular were extremely surprised in a way by the scale of the problem in Western capital markets and started to think we need to develop a different project. So point two, fragility. We see the emergence of the fragility of US power. Point one was the attempt to establish unipolarity. That didn't really go anywhere. It came close, but they couldn't have the whole world come to their knees and accept the imperial status of the US government. Didn't work. But secondly, by the 2000s, it became clear that the US project was extremely fragile, and US leadership was struggling between its own national interests and its international responsibilities as the leader of the world, and so on. If you're going to be the leader of the world system, you better take on a real responsibility. But the US government began to find stresses and strains, contradictions between its national interests, let's say international quote unquote responsibilities. So the second point is the emergence of this fragility. The third point, the Chinese project. Interestingly, after the world financial crisis, around that time, Vladimir Putin of Russia goes to the Munich Security Conference and he announces there is no single master in the world. There should be no single master. That's the phrase he uses. The first time the Russians, since 1991, openly talk against the United States. Putin, I want you to remember, was handpicked by Yeltsin to succeed him because they thought he would be a safe pair of hands. Putin inherited a destroyed Russia, and I think began to think that he wanted to rebuild Russian authority in the world. That comes later to Putin. In his early years, he's basically the successor to Yeltsin, including the second war on Chechnya and so on. He was not a threat to the West. The West, in fact, saw him as a principal ally, and they brought Russia during Putin's time deeper and deeper into the G7, which they then named the G8. But in 2006, he gives a speech, no single master. The real lesson is not learned in Moscow, although they did learn a lesson and started to rebuild their own networks and to break slightly from both US hegemony and the dollar system. The real lesson is learned in Beijing. You see, Beijing begins to understand that it had got caught up in what Raghuram Rajan, who at the time was the chief economist at the International Monetary Fund, later the head of the Reserve Bank of India, Raghuram Rajan says that China is caught up in a satanic embrace with the United States. China is providing cheap labor to the US. The US is then buying Chinese goods. China is getting surpluses, and then the surplus are being lent to the US to buy the Chinese goods. This is not a productive cycle. This is a satanic embrace. Now, it's not true that the Chinese were delivering cheap labor. They were also delivering labor that through the Chinese Revolution had become educated, had become well-fed, had become less sick. There were less sick days in Chinese factories than, let's say, in Indian factories. Workers in India, higher rates of malnutrition and so on. So it's not just cheap labor, it's higher quality workforces that were available. But nonetheless, this satanic embrace disturbed the Chinese. So they embarked on a project to de-pivot away from the US economy. This project went in three directions. Number one, to improve the internal market in China, for which they had to abolish absolute poverty, which they did a year and a half ago. They put a lot of emphasis on building infrastructure within the country to abolish absolute poverty, to increase the internal market. Some of this was indeed through construction, infrastructure building, but a lot of it was through trying to improve the consumption needs of the Chinese population, number one. Number two, and related to this, was to move the economic focus in China away from coastal China to its interior. This included incorporating Chinese minorities who had been neglected in the several decades of the Chinese Revolution. That means that more emphasis put on integrating the Uyghur people, the Tibetans, the Miao people, the Mongolians and others, whose economic development had been deeply neglected. So there was a so-called Go West policy established by Xi Jinping to improve the economic conditions of Western provinces of China. In other words, also create the internal market there. This second is actually related also to the third. You'll see all three of these points are related. Because when the Chinese government, under the leadership of Xi Jinping, began to develop Western China. This led inexorably to the Belt and Road Project, what was first known as One Belt, One Road, or the Silk Road Project, which meant going from Beijing out to Urumqi and then into the Central Asian republics, onward eventually to Europe and Africa. So the One Belt, One Road, or the Belt and Road Project, develops out of this Go West policy, and then is basically an attempt by the Chinese initially to move from US market reliance to creating new markets in other parts of the world. So the Chinese developed their own project. Related to these 3 points is a very important point. You see, when China opened up to Western capital, German capital, British capital, US capital, Singaporean capital, and so on, the Chinese made a maneuver that is novel to the third world. For instance, when Sri Lanka opened special economic zones or free trade areas, Sri Lankan capital, backed by the state, didn't demand that foreign companies must transfer technology. That demand was not made. In India as well, we didn't make that demand. We just said, okay, here's a plot of land, you can build a factory, but we didn't demand anything. We didn't say, okay, now give us your technology. The Chinese did. That was very clever. They said, look, you can set up a plant to build solar energy, but give us how you're doing it. You have to give us the technology. And because the Chinese insisted on, because they had a high quality workforce, these Western companies all accepted the deal. And this allowed China to accelerate its science and technology development. So today, in key areas, robotics, high-speed rail, 5G technology, biotechnology, and so on, China is at par with the West, or in fact, advanced from the West. This is the nature of the Chinese project. On the one side, expanding, building new markets in new places outside the West, and secondly, now appearing with technological and capital abilities that far exceed Western countries. And the new Cold War imposed by the United States, this new Cold War effectively is a response not to quote unquote Chinese aggression, which is just not on the table. There's no evidence of that. This new Cold War is a US imposed attack at China's advances, economic advances. It's an attempt to prevent the development of China. So that is the fourth point. Now, interestingly, the Chinese and other major powers that emerged were not looking to supplant the United States. You see, they were not interested in becoming the new hegemon. There is going to be no Chinese century. The evidence for that is quite clear. Number one, if you read the Chinese Foreign Ministry statements, they don't have any ambition for global leadership, partly because they don't want to take on that responsibility. It's an enormous responsibility. They want to share the responsibility. They don't want to be the single master. They have made this very clear in their intellectual documents, in their government documents, in public pronouncements by Xi Jinping. They don't believe that the era of one single master is any longer going to apply. That's very important. And therefore, the idea of the quote unquote Thucydides trap, which the US government has been reference to Thucydides, the ancient Greek writer, that when one power succeeds another, it ends up with a lot of violence. The Chinese are not prepared. They don't want to have a big war with the US. They don't want to contest the US for single master status because they are not interested in single master status. In a way, the Chinese, therefore, are also not interested in quote unquote multipolarity. They're not interested in that. They don't want to see many poles appear. They have a slightly different orientation, which I want to explain to you. The reason the term multipolarity is sometimes used, we have to be quite precise about it. Multipolarity is not necessarily the pathway to peace, because after all, multipolarity led to the Great War, the two great wars of the 20th century. So this is not necessarily a pathway to peace. The Chinese actually use two different concepts. They argue, and I tend to agree with this approach, that we need to establish the sanctity of multilateral institutions. So the first term is multilateralism. a return to the United Nations. The United Nations is the entity which is the largest consensus entity in the world. The UN Charter is the one which has got the most signatories of all countries. In fact, 7.9 billion people are signatories of the UN Charter. Now, the UN has been completely brutalized by US imperialism, but the Chinese argue through the establishment of, quote unquote, the group of friends in defense of the Chinese have argued for, in a way, a return to multilateralism, to have common problems solved by common and mutual respect and joint leadership. They're very keen on joint single master. So one concept put on the table is a return to multilateralism. The second concept put on the table is regionalism. There is a kind of keenness in the necessity of regionalism. The redevelopment in South America of UNASUR and Mercosur and South American integration using a South American currency and so on. In a way, the Shanghai Regional Corporation is also a regional organization, partly because it's Asia, it looks enormous, but it's a regional organization, revitalization of the African Union and so on. So the two concepts that are on the table are multilateralism and regionalism. And not a turn to single masters or to regional hegemons. I mean, I think there's a bit of sensitivity about this. Like, take the case of SAARC. SAARC has not worked, partly because India is simply the largest country in South Asia and uses that size and strength to exercise, in a way, single master status. And that's just not on. You need honest and democratic regional leadership. You don't want to have one single master in a region. That effectively could be multipolarity. South Africa dominates the African continent. India dominates South Asia. China dominates East Asia. That's not on. Brazil dominates South America. We're looking for a more democratic world order. So the concepts being pushed are multilateralism and regionalism. And that's the third point. Now, the fourth point. And this is the fifth point. The fourth was the multilateralism and regionalism. Fifth point, and the final one. You see, it's one thing to talk about the fact that we are in a phase where it's no longer is able to exercise the kind of quote unquote leadership that it tried to exercise in its own interest and the interests of its close allies. It's quite clear that those days are gone. The United States simply cannot exercise leadership. It doesn't have the economic resources to do so, or the political legitimacy. It doesn't have that. It has a military might, but it doesn't have the economic and political power and legitimacy. It also has the ability to control information. It has these two things, military and information, but it doesn't have economic and political power, not like it once attempted to have or had. On the other side, we have the arrival of important locomotives of the South, India, China, Indonesia, Mexico, Brazil, South Africa, and so on. They are gathering forces together. Some of them are in the G20, some of them are in the BRICS, and so on. They have important and impressive bilateral engagements. There are some stresses and contradictions, such as between India and China, but these are also slightly exaggerated. They also collaborate more than we. So does Japan and Russia, even in the midst of this crisis. Okay, so we are entering this new period. Now you have the BRICS Bank, or the New Development Bank by Dilma Rousseff in Shanghai, which is, got as much investable capital as the World Bank and is providing an alternative. We'll see what kind of project the New Development Bank actually creates. It's a new institution. All that is true. We have a kind of new opening. Oh, what are our projects? And let me just quickly, if you don't mind, give you the example, your own example of Sri Lanka. What are your projects? I mean, you remember where at Hambantota and the crisis that occasioned. Initially, the United States government used that port as an example of China's debt diplomacy. You'll remember that. A lot of pressure on the government. And Mr. What's his name? Ranil Wickremesinghe, who was an agent of US imperialism, sorry to say it so bluntly, was the flag bearer for that approach. And then two US academics took a close look at the documents on Hambantota and wrote an article, not in the World Communist Review or anything, but in the Atlantic magazine, an established liberal magazine in the United States. What they showed us is quite instructive. They showed us that the Chinese came in with investment money to build this port, which was necessary for Sri Lankan capital and perhaps for Sri Lanka as a country. But what they did was the assessment was that, look, first we'll build a part of the port together and then stop construction, start using the port, raise revenue. And after you've raised sufficient revenue and the port looks like it's going to be able to pay for itself, we'll do construction phase number 2. But the Sri Lankan government, after construction phase number 1, insisted that the whole port be built, and that bankrupted Sri Lanka over that port. Now, was that China or was that the Sri Lankan bourgeoisie that was impatient and irrational? It was the Sri Lankan bourgeoisie. So why I want us to think about this 5th point, we need to develop our own projects. The left within the third world needs to develop a project. We need to insist that democratic and patriotic forces in these countries, their own. Now, the fact that the Chinese come with investment capital, we should not allow the Chinese to come and impose their project either. We have to have our own project. We should work in collaboration. The Chinese say win-win is their goal to them. But you can't win-win if you don't have a project. If you're coming to the table with the Chinese investment people, Belt and Road people, and you say, whatever you want to do, you go ahead and do. Then it's just going to be win-win. You have a project on the table. What is our project? We as people on the left have to enter a new mindset. I think for us to merely be critics of capitalism is not enough. We have to find a way to put projects on the table which are actually credible, real, which solve the pressing needs of the people of the world, of our world, but also start advancing us to socialism. One of the reasons why we set up the research institute I direct, Tricontinental, is to start doing exactly this kind of thing, is to start thinking, what is the project of a country like, what is the capacity of us to demand socialistic policies now? It's not enough to just say we are against what's happening. What are we for? What kinds of projects do we think are possible now that we have, say, New Development Bank funding at our doorstep? What would we like to build? Is building housing the most important thing? Is workers' housing built in cooperatives the important thing? Are we going to follow what was done in Solapur, in Maharashtra, where trade unions essentially built a whole workers' neighborhood? Will that be a way forward? What are the productive designs we have for our countries? Simply, build, let's say, a giant projects, ports, dams, and so on? Or are we going to create workers' collectives, workers' cooperatives at scale, millions of workers in a cooperation, building some kind of productive venture? Are we going to go in that direction? That is what the discussions are in Venezuela. That's what in Kerala, the left is doing, is building scaled up cooperatives like the Ulangalal Labor Society, Construction Workers Cooperative, thousands of workers in a cooperative who build bridges. This is not a private capital in a public-private partnership. This is a cooperative in partnership with the state to build bridges. Are we going to think like that? So I feel like, right now the debate is, say, China, US, this, that, and the other. But I want to insist, comrades, what is our project? What do we as socialists, as communists, what are we putting on the table? How do we want to utilize this historical juncture where we are between periods, where the fragility of US hegemony has demonstrated that its time is over, and we can see ahead of us the emergence of multilateralism. But what do we want to do at the table of multilateralism? We don't want to enter that table without ideas. We want to come there and insist on a working class and peasant project for our own countries. We have to have that project. Otherwise, we'll miss this historical opportunity. This is, in fact, a historical opportunity. There's too much responsibility for us to miss this. These occasions don't come all the time. When you have a lot of jockeying around in the world for how to use, interregnum, as it were, this period between two settled certainties. It's a historical opportunity. We have to take it. Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot, Vijay Prasad, for that eye-opening lecture. Now we will have another 30 minutes of Q&A, and I would like to unmute and ask questions. But before that, I myself have a question. So I would start with myself. So my question to Vijay is that now that I believe that since we are entering to this multipolar era, I believe if you're a political organization or a country, your task should be how themselves in this new era of multipolarity. My question is this: if that's the case, what do you think, or how do you think that Sri Lanka should position themselves in this multipolar region, in a situation where we have declared bankruptcy now, and we have geopolitical tensions in our waters? So can you please elaborate? Thanks.
Well, Kasun, to be completely clear, it's not for me to tell how you should try to position yourself. That's for you to decide. So I want to be quite straightforward about that. On the other hand, it's interesting. There's a debate going on in South America around de-dollarization. So the Lula of Brazil went to Argentina at a summit with Alberto Fernandez. They decided that more and more Brazil-Argentina trade will happen in their regional currencies. Now, this is hardly, in my opinion, a revolutionary development, although it's an important development. If countries in South Asia use a digital currency to reconcile internal trade in South Asia, they don't have to use the dollars. The dollar is not a mystical currency. So you can actually come up with a mechanism. But it's not a revolutionary, but I think could be talked about as a discussion. I'm talking now South America. Imagine if the South American countries developed something like what the Europeans did with air. If the South American countries developed, say, a regional commodity chain, equitable democratic regional commodity chain project around certain key things that needed to be built. For instance, if there was a electric car project for South America, where they developed their own electric cars. South America has a lot of lithium in Bolivia, Argentina, and in Chile. And Bolivia, in fact, has developed with Chinese assistance the ability to use the lithium to make its own batteries and has made a small car. In fact, Bolivia by itself has made a small car. If Bolivia can do it, any country can do it. But actually, it's far better to create these things on a continental level. So to use the advantages of different countries and to, essentially build commodity chain processes, which we're all going to have to live with for a long time. We can't go beyond, we can't return to the national economy. We're all going to live with commodity chains, but can we democratize them? Can we make them less hierarchical? Can we move beyond, in a way, kind of dependency of raw material extraction and importing of finished goods? Can we make commodity chains equitable? That kind of discussion and debate, I think, is pretty important. It could be interesting, for instance, in South Asia, if the countries didn't have such agreements to set a table and start talking about what could be a South Asian commodity chain project. Imagine if all South Asian countries got together and talked about creating like a garment commodity chain between these countries, high-end garments, all kinds of garments, or high-tech things. There's a way in which you can create democratized socialist commodity. That's one way we can take advantage of the moment. Of course, you're going to have to create a national project as well, Kasun. That's the first thing I said. But I'm giving you another example of, in this moment, developing innovators to think socialist commodity chains.
Okay, thanks. Any more questions? You can unmute and ask. Thank you.
Yes, I have a question. My name is Vagisha Gunasekara. It's really a pleasure to hear you speak, Mr. Prasad. My question is about and reviving the left amidst a fleeting a window where our circumstances of retaining this ideology, socialism, has become very difficult, particularly in the current context where the name of the game has become privatization, crushing of trade union action, any attempt for people's resistance, not the type of resistance that we saw last year in the Aragale. I would argue that that was a staged one with this backing, at least a major part of it, even though organically there was some resistance to begin with. But what kind of strategies, methods here and elsewhere to particularly inspire the younger generation about industrialization, the importance of multilateralism, the importance of regionalism, because that I speak to, and I speak to a lot of young people, everybody's a convert. And this goes back to your previous point about the US controlling information. It's very difficult to condition somebody who's been brainwashed. There is a reality that is different, right? So just, I guess there's no real answer to this, but I'm asking, since you travel a lot, you work across country, have you come up with certain strategies, methods that you can use to sort of revive and retain the left or leftist ideas? Thank you.
You asked that question very well. That's a great question. And I'm going to make, I suppose, 3 points, which are also relatively interrelated. You know, when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, or was assassinated, by the way, I joined the party just before the Soviet Union collapsed. So that's my generation. I'm 56 years old. We were the destroyed generation because people in my generation were like, what, you're going to be a communist? Are you crazy? The Soviet Union has just collapsed. China had just opened its Shenzhen region and so on, and there was a lot of confusion. But for maybe a decade, maybe 15 years after that, there was a real hesitancy for communists to be proud of our histories, proud of our ideas, and so on. And I think we were cautious about being out in a kind of straightforward way. We were very cautious, and the constant attacks, which continue till today, are debilitating. They're neurological. You know, they're exhausting. It's difficult to survive in them. But I take in the Communist Manifesto, written in 1848, when there were barely any communists in the world, by the way, and barely any trade unions in the world. When Marx and Engels writes, the communists are not, they're not going to conceal their aims. You know, I mean, these two fellows sitting in Brussels write this line when there are barely any communists in the world and barely any trade unions. The communists are not going to conceal their aims. We should talk proudly and openly about our views, regardless of the attacks against us. We need to be confident. We need to inspire confidence. I think that a lot of the answer to your question is also in our attitude. We should not be defensive. We should not, as communists, be hesitant. We should be, and also we should not be merely critical. You know, we should not sound like the party of no. We've got to have ideas for how to take the mantle of leadership in the world. So firstly, I would say that it's a question of attitude. You know, we need to be bold. We need to be open. We need to be filled with humor and not communists always angry and serious. We've got to have a sense of love and compassion for the peoples of the world. I joined the communist movement because I love human beings. I didn't join the communist movement because I'm serious all the time and forget how to laugh and so on. This has become a problem in our movement, in my opinion, is that sometimes we are too serious as we don't reach out to people. That's one. It's a matter of attitude. It's a kind of matter of conveying the fact that we can solve problems. Secondly, again, related to this, the question of the innovations necessary in organizing and building up power. It is true that the 19th century reservoirs of the left, the trade movement, even the peasant movement, have been pretty hard hit by precarious labor conditions, by the kind of new military type factories, the maquiladora type factories, the SEZ type factories, which make union organizing very difficult. The kind of intimidation, particularly of young women workers in these factories and so on. We have to come to terms with the fact the locus of organizing might need to change. We must perhaps do more organizing in working class communities, neighborhoods, organizing, different platforms. In India, the organize people in their places they live has borne great fruit, particularly in the farmers movement. You can't necessarily organize landless farm workers in the fields, organize them in their homes, in their neighborhoods. The third point, and this is a cautionary note, in India, there was the massive farmers' rebellion, which got Modi to go on the back foot and for the first time withdraw legislation. That was a successful movement, which was partly led by the communists through the All India Kisan Sabha, not entirely. It was a broad front movement. There were religious organizations and so on. It proves the importance of a broad front for these mass struggles. But shortly after the victory of the farmers, the BJP won the elections in Uttar Pradesh, in areas where the farmers had mobilized in enormous numbers. The BJP won those seats. How do you explain that? To some extent, it has to do with the power of money in democracy. We have been put on the back foot by democratic processes being basically hijacked by money power. We have to run campaigns for better democracy to delegitimize the kind of democratic institutions we have today. These are not democracies. These are monocracies. These are moneyocracies. The BJP spends more money than the US political parties in their presidential elections. And a lot of that money is legal. They've created these election bonds, which effectively has legalized black money in elections. This has to be talked about much more. We have to, in a way, talk about how limited bourgeois democracy is. It's basically money democracy. That has to be out there in the public domain. People need to be galvanized that democracy is in danger, is in threat. In India, the Constitution is in danger. Just democratic institutions. They even want to revise the Constitution using punctual use of neo-fascist violence against people. Our comrades are in jail and so on. So I don't want to exaggerate for us, but I would say the 3 points are: one, we need to be much more open in our views about the future, about the possibilities. We need to be hopeful, communists, not just the party of no. I think secondly, we must be out there, trying to build the working class power, not necessarily at the point of production, where it is getting difficult to build power, but perhaps at the point where people live in their homes and so on, build working class power where we can build it among students as well, of course, an essential phalanx of power for the socialist movement. But then I think this is what's important is we also have to have a sober sense that in these bourgeois democratic structures, our ability to contest elections is minimal. We need to find a way to build democratic fronts with with parties that are not working class parties, but are able to, or at least accept the fact that democracy is basically a sham in many of our countries, and not the democracy of people, but the democracy. So, I mean, I guess these are three quick things, but your question is so good, we can spend hours discussing it.
Asun, may I have a question?
Yes, please.
Yes, so thank you very much for this, I think, interesting explanation of world situation. Now, my question is that now the collapse of Soviet Union in 1991, the entire Western world of the communism phase has been ended. What is now the present philosophical situation, and what is the role of China and other countries so that they can fight that view? Because he's thinking that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the entire socialist movement and the countries has been collapsed. That is a big blow for the communist movement in the world at 100%. So with the leadership of China, whatever the other countries, what are the strategies?
I think we lost the last part of that. Was clear.
Yeah, I think so too.
I think I got the point. I mean, look, we are in a different phase of human history. China is playing an important role, no doubt about that. And it's very clear that Xi Jinping is leading a left revival in China. The kind of encouragement of Marxism, the encouragement of studying the history of the Chinese Revolution, the move for a left agenda, and so on. No doubt about that. That China is playing a new under the leadership of Xi Jinping. But I don't think Beijing is the center of the world revolution. I think the center of the world revolution is in the heart of every worker, in the heart of every person. That's how I understand the communist tradition. We don't need a new Moscow. We have our own understandings, our own working class experiences, and so on. I think that there's a shift now from what the situation was in the 1990s, when there was a lot of gloom about Marxism, and when the idea that communism was over actually had traction. We're in a different period. I don't think young people in many, there is interest, much more interest in Marxism or left ideas. There's an interest in anarchism. A lot of young people go into anarchist traditions or to smallest beautiful traditions, environmental traditions. We need to engage with all of those currents. We need to engage with them, not to necessarily attack them, but to bring people to understand the importance of some of the ideas we are putting forward. You see, when I am confronted by, let's say, young anarchists, I don't tell them you're wrong in your opinion. I tell them you're right in that you've broken with the neoliberal capitalist consensus. That is, you've done something phenomenal in breaking with that consensus. Now the question is, does the tradition that you belong to have answers for the present? Does it help you build movements? Does it help you build working class power? If it helps you, go ahead and do it. I don't need to hegemonize you. Go ahead and do that. But be clear that the point of breaking with the neoliberal consensus isn't merely to feel good about yourself. It's to be out there building working class power, building democracy and socialism, socialist democracy. If environmentalists find that they can build socialist democracy through an environmental tradition, go ahead, we'll work with you. We'll build a broad front. You don't need to come with us. We are not seeking to have everybody under our tent, but we can still engage with them and say, look, on many issues, you don't have a good answer. We want to have a discussion and a debate and so on. So I think actually far more people than we acknowledge are wanting to break with the neoliberal consensus, and they're going into all kinds of arenas of struggle. As I said, environmentalism, anarchism, small is beautiful, and so on. We should not be dismayed by that. We should engage them. We should work with them. We should try to build projects with them to teach them about the correctness of our assessment and analysis. They are not our problem. We are not in a situation when Lenin, for instance, wrote about left-wing extremism, an infantile disorder. We are not in that era when the left was growing and a sectarian trend was creating problems. This is not our problem. Right now, Our problem is that people are breaking from the neoliberal consensus, but we are not able to have an adequate dialogue with them. Before you attack them as, say, ultra leftists or bourgeois liberals or whatever, we have to first engage them. We have to bring them in, start doing activities with them, and so on. And one of the reasons we designed Red Books Day on February 21st every year, the day of the publication of the Communist Manifesto. This year, 1 million people went into public and read books in public. 1 million people. I mean, next year on February 21st, Comrade Wilfred, I hope that at least 20,000 people in Sri Lanka will read books in public from Colombo to Jaffna. That would be amazing if 20,000, 30,000 Sri Lankans join Red Books Day next year. The reason we built the project of Red Books Day is a part of our theory of rescuing the collective life, bringing our people into the public domain, engaging with other forces, bringing them into these kind of public activities, basically building relationships with other people who've broken with the neoliberal consensus. That's where we have to develop, in my opinion.
Thank you for your answer. We can take another question from someone, since we have come to the end of the discussion.
Hi, I have a question. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
Hi, Vijay. That was a very enlightening talk. As usual, I've followed a lot of your talks. I guess the question I have is related to what you said about multipolarity and regionalism being a component of it. And you mentioned SAARC and India, and I think that's very topical in Sri Lanka right now. So as you must be aware of the history, I think there are a lot of contradictions between Sri Lanka and India, both within the left and among a lot of progressive nationalists. So I'm just wondering what your take on India is right now, because its position in the world seems a bit strange in the sense that nominally it is part of this multipolar movement, and it has taken an independent position on Russia, but at the same time it is being quoted by the Quad, and also the views of India and Indian capital, say companies like Adani in the region and among progressives are, I don't know how to put it, I guess, skeptical at best and, very, very critical, let's say, right? Especially with Sri Lanka's current IMF program and the looming privatizations, where it seems that Indian capital is going to benefit a lot from it. So just sort of quickly, I'm wondering, how do you these things and what are your thoughts on them?
Yeah, thanks a lot. That's a great question. Firstly, India is right now governed by a right-wing government, which comes from a political tradition from the 1920s that was not anti-imperialist, and in fact in the 1950s was a pro-US political force in India, highly marginal at the time, because in India the consensus was more towards socialism and non-alignment. So the RSS and the Jan Sangh, highly marginal forces, pro-US from the beginning and pro-Israel. So when the BJP comes to power, initially it paved the road to quote unquote greater normalization with the United States. Now you got to remember that it's not the BJP that exercises normalization with the US and Israel. It's actually the Congress party. In fact, therefore, it's the Indian bourgeoisie that seeks normalization with the West as a way to secure its own class advantages in the world. It was very clear that this was the Indian bourgeoisie wanting to normalize with the United States, wanting therefore to have a seat at the global table. Okay, the BJP has this older pro-US tradition, but effectively it operated as the agent of the bourgeoisie, just like the Congress from the 1990s. So there's no real difference between the two main bourgeois parties regarding the alignment to the US. But there are contradictions. And because of the kind of failures or the fragility of US power, it was quite clear to the Indian bourgeoisie that its national interests or its narrow national bourgeois interests were not going to be fulfilled by getting with the United States. That US power's fragility, particularly economic fragility, was threatening the ability of Indian bourgeois power from being either exercised in India or abroad. It was simply not a pragmatic or rational decision to be wedded to the United States. So it's quite interesting that the Indian government motivation around the war in Ukraine and Russia is not premised on a historical pro-US view alone. It's premised upon its national interests. So the Indian government continues to buy energy from Russia and has made it very clear it's not going to break with Russia. It's not even going to Russia and so on. That's not because of some kind of left-wing turn by the right-wing government, but because they are motivated by their national interests. Adani, Ambani, and so on, they are motivated by their national bourgeois pecuniary narrow interests as well. So the Indian government right now is caught between two stools. One stool is the stool of its allegiance to the United States, its historical relationship, and that leads it into the Quad that is intensified by the right-wing government's antipathy to China and so on. So one stool is the Quad, anti-China and all of that. But there's another stool, that's the stool of the quote-unquote interests of the national bourgeoisie and to some extent interests of the nation. Because, after all, they have to govern a country where if energy prices, say, double, there will be 1 million mutinies in India and they will not be able to control things. As it is, it's touch and go in parts of India. So the Indian government has made it quite clear. And I'm an old friend of the energy minister. He used to be the US ambassador to the United Nations. He's an interesting gentleman. He's the energy minister. He's made it very clear that India is not going to stop buying energy from Russia, particularly at prices, because India has an obligation to not allow 1 million mutinies to take place. So there are two stools in the room: the stool of allegiance to the US, but then both a combination of national bourgeois interests and national interests. And I think that's where we're seeing the Indian government is somewhere caught between these two stools. Now, stool number 2, national interests and national bourgeois interests, has led India into more engagement with the BRICS. It's led India to have actually interesting relations with China, where it's not, India banned TikTok, but then froze everything there. It can't ban everything because then India produce a lot of original technology. It relies on a lot of Chinese tech. So it's impossible to ban everything from China. Banning TikTok was a symbolic thing, but it didn't ban Chinese 5G tools. That was not banned. Then India won't have cell networks. The Indian bourgeoisie is very good at being a rentier bourgeoisie. It's not great at being a productive bourgeoisie. What are the Indian use? Let me ask you, how many Indian apps are on your phone? How many Indian phones do you use? Where is the Indian phones? When I was a child or young person in the 1970s, I had a HMT watch, a Indian-made watch. In our house, the first camera that my father bought was an Indian camera made by an Indian company, government concern. Hindustan Machine Tools made good watches. They were cheap, effective. You had to keep because it was a winding watch, but it was not a bad one. Where is Hindustan Machine Tools today? Why hasn't HMT created a cell phone? If India is such a great regional hegemon, why are you using Indian phones? So these are the net contradictions for even a right-wing government, my friends. It's not able to sustain these contradictions. And hence, it sort of oscillates one way or the other. One way, some harsh statement about China, next minute, Jaishankar is out there criticizing the West. And I think that's where we are. We're caught between these two stools.
Okay, that's a really good way to end the conversation, because we have actually reached the end of our conversation. I think that we have learned a lot today, and I would like to thank Vijay again for joining us to give this very interesting lecture for the 80th anniversary of the Communist Party of Sri Lanka. We're actually honored to have you. And I hope that we'll be working together even in the future. And I would like to thank the others who joined via Zoom to listen to this. If you missed any of the parts of the lecture, this will be uploaded into YouTube, and we will be sharing the content in our Facebook pages and our other social media pages as well. So thanks a lot, Vijay. It was a very nice lecture, and I don't know where you are though at the moment. So good evening, I guess. Thanks a lot, everyone. So thank you for joining.
Thanks,
Vijay.
Kasun, and congratulations again to the Communist Party.
Thank you.
Thanks, Vijay. Thanks, Kazun.